for ending your day with me. Hopefully you're in the right place. Can't we all just get along at the end of this discussion? And I hope we all do. To start things off, just a little bit about me. I'm a senior UX designer at Hook 42, and you can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet. I like to contribute as much as I can to the admin UI effort, talk about all kinds of designy things on Twitter. I've spent about 10 years now doing agency work in a lot of different teams, from waterfall to agile and everything in between. So I've had a lot of exposure to different operations and trying to find the best way for everyone to work together, and I've found what works best for me, so hopefully you guys can take something from this to bring back to your teams as well. Full disclosure though, I'm not a developer. I've done my fair share of helping front-end developers do the best they can with what I give them and figuring out a good happy medium for that. But I am not going to tell you guys how to code your code, so that's not what this is. A little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about though today. So we're going to dive into some myths around the perspectives that each team is coming into all of this with, and hopefully debunking those. And then we'll talk about how we're going to bring development into the design phase, and then vice versa, the design and the development phase, and kind of what happens in between, and then what happens after. So the first myth that I want to talk about is that the designer knows no code. It's a stigma out there that a lot of designers are very reluctant to learn about code, but one thing that I do want to talk about is, that backlash with it's not my job to know it, I shouldn't need to understand it, and that's definitely not the case. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that we merge both of those fields, right? That's just crazy. But what we do need to kind of realize is that in order to work seamlessly and more productively, there needs to be some kind of understanding from the designer side of things of just how functionality works on the web, right? Like, if you're building something and you don't know how it works, is that really going to be effective? So we need to make sure that we're promising ourselves and our team that we do the best job of staying relevant and being aware of exactly what it takes to build a website, even if that means I can't write the code, that's fine, but I have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS and kind of how that works. It's really going to help the designers figure out how to streamline the process and make sure that we're not over-promising a lot of things. So this is my promise. And it's a long promise, but basically what it says is that we're going to do the best we can to kind of work together and understand what each other is doing on both sides of things, to not set expectations out the window. The next myth that I want to talk about is that the developer must not know any design. The opposite end of the spectrum, right? So when you're building front-end development, hopefully you have some kind of expectations around white space and not exact aesthetics of the vision of a designer, right? But you should also have a basic understanding of this is getting really confusing, this isn't working, these colors aren't accessible, that kind of thing. It's really nice to be able to have that other perspective as well. And it's also really helpful so that way when you're building a product, you can raise red flags, right? That maybe an outsider's perspective can bring to the conversation. Busted. So again, I'm not really suggesting that you become a designer, right? We still have our areas of expertise that we're good at, but making sure that you can give good estimations based on level of effort with design recommendations, and being able to kind of say, why don't we try this instead? Because I think that this would better fit the process and the budget that we have. Okay, so the same thing as a designer making a promise. I'm gonna give you guys this promise, the developers in the room here, to kind of bring forth to your design team and say, I recognize the decisions that you're making. I might not 100% know everything that you're doing, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that the decisions I'm making are also useful, and I understand exactly what it is that you're doing. The last thing I want to talk about is the collaboration myth. One handoff is enough. One conversation from a designer to the developer is enough. I've often found myself in this situation a lot, where I'm working on a project as a designer and I've never talked to a developer, and then suddenly it's time for them to build it. And that's just crazy. This isn't the 60s anymore. We need to kind of grow and evolve with the technologies that we're building, right? All of this stuff is more modern, but for some reason, we have this like stay in your lane mindset when it comes to project management and team like cross collaboration. And I really think that we need to kind of like kick that to the curb and do our best efforts to keep each other involved from the very beginning to the very end. So you're going to need to make sure that just as much as designers are on board in the beginning with including development, in the development phase, we're going to make sure that designers have some insight into what's going on as well. So, as a team, we need to make the following commitment, that we make sure designers are always talking to a developer, maybe not the whole team, right, but some kind of point of contact where they are able to give like some more educated decisions about the functionality that a designer is proposing. And then developers should always be including some sort of design review of the decisions that are being made. And each team values each other's input and honors the commitment to delivering the quality that goes into that. So let's collaborate during design. Design comes before build. So how do we get the developers involved early on? And like, why do the developers need to be involved early on? What is the point of adding more people in the process? Because isn't having too many cooks in the kitchen like a bad thing? What we want to be aiming for when we're adding development on into the design phase of the process is making sure that the recommendations are on track and on scope. Project expectations are realistic for the client right from the beginning. Making sure that everyone is informed from start to finish about the solutions that we're trying to solve for. And then making sure that we can kind of eliminate some pre-build bugs, like a designer saying that we can build this thing, but the technology we're using doesn't support that. Trying to eliminate those things before it even gets presented to the client, right? So how do we do it? It sounds like a really great idea, but what's the process look like to do that? There are 3 phases of design we can really break it down into that we can incorporate the development team in the process. So each phase is, we have the research phase, we have the wireframe phase, and we have the design phase. And this might be different project to project, right? Like some projects don't have wireframes or whatever, and that's okay. But basically what I want to convey here is that we have this process where we're doing an internal review with a development team before a client ever sees it. How do we do that, right? We need to designate a champion of development, right? There's going to be one person from your development team that is going to be the person like responsible for collaborating with the designer. And ideally this will be a developer that is working on the project build once it gets to that point, but sometimes that's not always the case. They're usually maybe busy building something else and they don't have time to sit in on the meetings. So what happens? Delegate someone that has a general idea of how the process works, right? That can then communicate that to the developers working on the project. At Hook 42, we call them architects. So I want to go back and kind of break down each phase of design here. And in the research phase, what happens? So we are usually kind of like grabbing ideas from the wild and looking for inspiration. We're making mood boards and things like that. And right here is where we start to get crazy as designers with all these ideas. And we're not even checking with anyone about it, right? We're just like putting pretty pictures together and we're saying, yeah, this is great. And you show the client and the client falls in love with something that we showed them and didn't tell them it wasn't possible to build. That seems really crazy to me, right? So what you want to do is make sure that someone looks at it before you send it to the client, right? Then we get into the wireframes phase, the juicy stuff for designers, right? We're starting to really put the pieces together. And this is where we start to present physical concepts to the client and start making promises that we really are intending to keep, right? But again, we're making assumptions if we're not talking to our developers before we do that. So we need to make sure that we have a solidified like outline of components We're going through how we think those components are going to work with the developers, and this is where the functionality piece of designers needing to understand code can really become helpful, because we can think about it also analytically and be like, well, I think that this takes longer to build than this, and this is what our budget is, so maybe I don't recommend this. And we don't know that every time, and that's why that conversation with developers needs to happen. Let me check with the developers. That's a phrase I want designers to remember forever and ever and ever. If you're having a conversation with a client and a developer isn't on a call, the client's like, wow, I really like this, but I think we can jazz it up a little bit, right? I want some more snazzy things. I want to make it pop. Great feedback, right? The designer is thinking, I really want to make it snazzy too. And they agree. And then you go back to your team and you're like, the client asked for this, so we need to do it. Well, we don't have time to do that. That takes too long. That takes too much effort. Something that doesn't fit within the scope or the budget or the timeline. If you just say to the client, that sounds like a great idea, let me check with the developers, that eliminates all that headache, right? So it's a couple of words that can really change the outcome of the entire project and how that flows. And the last phase, the best phase, right? The design phase. This is where the magic happens. And this is, again, a place where designers can accidentally make a lot of false promises, because not only are we presenting the concepts of what goes on the page, but now we're starting to talk about how the page moves, how it interacts, and ultimately the really crazy things that designers like to do sometimes, and I am guilty of. We just kind of like aim for the stars, and then we need someone to talk to us on our team and be like, you need to come back down to earth, please. So we need to make sure that it's a very simple process. We just need to add developers in one extra step. Normally, internally with design teams, you're talking to a creative director, at least another creative on your team, and they just need to have someone with that technical background to also be there to contribute to that conversation. And we want all of you to contribute to that conversation. So like I was saying before, developers, it would be really great if you had some sense of like general design practices, right? Why is that? So you can give me feedback, constructive feedback. It's really great when you have other members of your team that aren't design background influenced people to say, why did you do that? And ask that question, right? And then you can think about it from a different point of view. So not only as a developer, are you going to say, well, that just takes too long, or that technology doesn't work. You can actually provide some extra insight that is another angle that we haven't necessarily been thinking about. And this isn't just for developers either. This is for project managers, VPs, strategists, content authors, whoever. As long as you are asking why and we have to explain it, a lot of times we might think of another solution that might work better. And it's really great to have that kind of collaboration on your team. So, we've got to know, like I was saying before, why. When someone asks you why, and you have to think a really long time about why you did something, maybe that wasn't the best approach to do it. So having someone there to say, to kind of question you, not personally, don't take it personally, it's just a way to kind of pull out the details that maybe you didn't think about and then put them all back together into like a nicer looking piece, right? So we've made it through the design phase and we've had all this great help from the developers. So do we need to have a developer handoff? Of course we do. This is what it looks like, right? As a designer, a project is your baby, and you're just handing your baby off to somebody. And if this is real life, and you're handing your child to a babysitter, right? You're not just gonna like walk away without any lists of things to do and allergies and all kinds of like crazy details, right? That you want to make sure that they don't miss anything that's really important and your child is safe and doesn't get injured. Well, the same thing happens with a website project, right? You're going to hand off your project and you're going to want to make sure that you're going through all the things that have come up with client conversations and talking about functionality requirements and other details that aren't really that easy to interpret from like a static mock-up. There's going to be a lot of questions. So until now, we've only had one primary point of contact from development also, right? The official handoff should really be a working session internally where the development team, hopefully as many people as possible that are going to be building the project, can all sit down together and really talk about each individual piece of the page and how all of that stuff works together. A lot of times in the handoffs, the designer is just kind of going through a mock-up and nobody's really listening because everybody's multitasking, and that's really not ideal, right? The most important thing is to make sure that we eliminate all the distractions so that you guys can ask questions that make the development easier. So what does this typically look like? It's normally about an hour or two of just a conversation where we are going through each piece and we start to kind of put together tickets and prioritize tasks and do things like that, where we can start to build the requirements with the project manager and the developer, and we can say, this is what this entails, and hopefully that makes it easier to start building all of those pieces when the time comes to implement those items. So now we're going to start building. I'm sure it can be simplified into like a much smaller journey than what I'm going to go through here with you guys, but the ultimate thing I want to talk about is like what the goals are of having the design team being brought into the development phase. So it's not uncommon to have a QA process when it comes to building out your stuff, right? But it's not common to usually have a design QA person. And as the pieces are being built out on the front end, designers will be able to kind of provide an additional level of feedback and perspective about the functionality, because remember, this is my baby and I just gave it to you. Of course I'm going to have a lot of things to say about what you're doing with it, right? So how do we do it? It sounds like a pretty good idea, right? You're probably familiar with the basic development cycle and QA cycle, where you assign a ticket and the QA team is looking at it, and then you determine if it's working or not, and then you kind of go back and forth until you've finished what you're working on, and then you approve it to go live. But what you might not be thinking about is, again, the little designer sitting in the corner that's like, hey, can I take a look at that? Can I have a peek? So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to designate a design champion, just like we had a development champion. And the design champion is most likely going to be the designer who worked on the prototype. But again, that's not always the case. The design champion, if it can't be the designer that was working on the project, should probably be someone like the creative director or a specific front-end facing QA person that you add onto your team. I have worked in teams in the past that have had like a back-end and a front-end QA team, and that has also been very different because it's not the designer itself working on it, but it still works out really great because you have someone doing that design, like comparison of the mock-up to the browser and doing them side by side. And a lot of times that gets overlooked when you have like a standard QA team that is looking at all of those things as a whole. So this is what that's going to look like. We're just going to kind of add an extra step in the process from before, though. Instead of approving it to go live after the development QA has been done, what we're going to do is we're going to just add a little phase in between where it goes from like the development functional QA to the front end QA. And if the designer finds any bugs, they'll reassign the task back to the front end developer, and then the cycle will just repeat itself. So what are we learning from all of this? Design and development QA should sign off on all items before a client sees it. How many of you guys have been building projects and then you send it off to a client and someone else was like, hey, how come I didn't see that? Most of you, right? And it gets really frustrating when things are going so fast and all these pieces are moving around and you're just like, I just want to look at that really quick right before it goes out the door. So it's really important to kind of bring this into your process early on and have this frame of mind where I need to make sure that all the people that were involved are actually seeing it before we're handing it off to a client. Because sometimes it's getting built and there's pieces that are missing and we're showing a client something that's maybe not finished all the way, and then that's not being communicated clearly to them, and then they think it's broken, and it's just a cycle that is really hard to kind of rein back in once that ball gets rolling in the direction like that. So we've done the QA process where we have the development team look at it, and we have the QA process where the design team has looked at it. But what happens when a development bug affects design? It's a big elephant in the room, right? A lot of times when the development team finds a bug, in my experience, you're going to do the quickest solution you can to fix it when it isn't a functional thing, right? You're like, oh, that font just looks a little bit too big, and I'm just going to change the size of it. Sometimes that's a really quick fix, and that's okay. But sometimes that one little tiny thing actually messed up something else on another page, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to try again to make sure you're keeping everyone involved in the process. Are we seeing a theme here? Everyone needs to know everything, right? So the best way to kind of take this approach, though, is just to loop the designer right back into the process. So you're going to notice that something is like kind of quirky, and you're like, oh, that should be a quick fix. Maybe that's just a conversation you have in Slack, though, right? Maybe it's just like, hey, how do you feel about this? And it's okay. But sometimes it might be a little bit more of a big deal, and it might have more impact, and you might need to kind of recreate another ticket, right? You're just going to kind of start back over and say, hey, can you redesign this piece? And the process just starts all over again, the same as we're doing before. Build it, QA it by both teams, and then repeat the steps as necessary. So we've got another elephant in the room. The functional requirements are changing in the design QA. Why is this happening? Sometimes the designers are requesting a functionality change when they see things because maybe it doesn't have the same behavior as they intended it, or maybe it just doesn't look right. And maybe it's because the client saw it and they were like, we need to change how this is working. And when we have this issue, a lot of times we need to make sure that we actually have the efforts available to take a step back and redo it. And I'm not going to get into like crazy detail here, but let's imagine that we have an unlimited budget and all the time in the world. So we're going to go ahead and start over, all over again. So a designer is going to just report the bug, right? It goes back to development. And then together, in harmony, the developers and the designers, we're going to work together in the same process that we were before, where we're just, reporting the bug, making sure everyone reviews it, and everyone gets a say before it goes out the door. So we didn't talk about this one yet. Planning. It's really great to have all those people involved, but it's also a lot of extra people in the room that we hadn't thought about before. So how do we plan for it? The toughest challenge that designers face in this process is not reluctance from the development team getting their work checked. It's actually buy-in from project managers and people maybe higher up in the chain, like your sales team, giving ample time for this sort of review. Since we aren't doing this as a standard practice right now, it's really hard for teams to implement having the resources available to do this kind of QA. And it's not always a quick task either, right? So what you're going to need to do is educate the people on your team. This is your responsibility now. Make sure that you're explaining to the project owners that you need more time. You're telling your sales team, this requires more time. Whoever you need to tell that is scoping projects and doing forecasting, you might not get there before the project you're working on now, right? But you can say, hey, this would have worked really a lot better if we could have done it this way. And can we plan the next project to be that way? So what you need to have time for, right? This is a good list. You're checking the intended functionality is accurate. You're comparing the deliverable that you handed off and the development environment to one another and making sure they match as closely as possible. Then you're going to want to document your findings if there are areas of improvement. And I'm stressing this one because documentation of your bugs is just as time-consuming as looking at it and finding it. When you're documenting bugs, you're oftentimes explaining the issue, but you can also explain the solution, especially if you are understanding of like the basics of the requirements of HTML and CSS, and you can be like, oh, well, I think you should just maybe change the way that the flex is on this or something like that. You're also going to want to make sure that you have time to make new mockups if you need to do that as well. And then you're going to want to re-review everything. Did I just say re-review everything? Yeah, so what I'm getting at is that sometimes when we have our bug fixes, it requires heavy lifting. And we talked about the process of like kind of having to start over for certain changes, and that requires time, right? So there are a lot of things that need to be accounted for when we're doing QA, and making sure that there's actually follow through and follow up in the QA process that just usually falls out of the budget and scope of projects. So we're doing a lot of checking and no one's really accounting for it, and this is where stuff starts to get crazy because we have all these people rushing to try and do things and not enough time to implement all the things that we're trying to do at the end of a project. So we're going to change that, right? There's another thing that I haven't mentioned yet, the full site review. So right now we're actually going through ticket by ticket, and we're going component by component, and we haven't really looked at the full page. So again, I'm saying that we're reviewing another thing. I promise it's not as crazy as it sounds. This is what we're looking for when we do this last run through. This is the one that's going to be hopefully quick and painless. This is not the time where designers get crazy anymore. We're just making sure that all of our previous bugs were resolved, the cohesiveness of all of the pieces worked together on the page like we wanted them to, and that we're making sure nothing has really slipped through the cracks while we've been scrambling at the end to get to the finish line, right? So let's set some expectations around how to do this. Right now we're all on cloud 9, right? We're all singing hand in hand, designers and developers getting along, we're having a great time. But did anyone actually think about how this would work? Again, we need to make sure that we're planning. But what does that mean? Allocations are key. I'm going to circle back to this again because making sure that everyone has enough time to take care of what they need to do to get their stuff done right is the biggest hurdle in all of this. We need to make sure that as designers, we're giving the development team enough time to implement the changes that we're requesting, right? And that might not always be the designer's fault because we're at the end of a project and we're running out of time, we're running out of scope. But if we planned it accordingly, like we were talking about before, hopefully the QA is happening with enough time for changes to be implemented. And hey, if there's not that many changes that need to be made, we finished early. What is this? I've never heard of this crazy thing, right? Hopefully that would be the case and it would be a great reward, but that usually doesn't happen. And usually what happens is we find these bugs and then we're scrambling to fix them because we haven't allowed ourselves enough time to go back and redo the work that we need to do. So I'm recommending this insane, crazy QA process, and I'm thinking, how much QA is too much QA? We're not just in it for the money, right? We're in it to make sure we're upholding our promises and our standards, and we're making sure that the product that we're giving our clients is actually going to benefit them. So if we need to add some extra time to make sure that it's actually working the way it's intended to work, this is how we're going to learn how to set up that process on the next project. And it's going to be a learning curve to kind of start to implement these things because they're new, right? It's going to be trial and error for how much extra time you're going to need. And you might get it wrong the first time, and that's okay. But design iterations should also be flexible. So we need to be able to prioritize what the bugs we're finding are, because some of it might just be a preferential thing that is going to impact the budget in a way that maybe we should just hold that off for phase 2, right? Or maybe we just say we'll pass on that one because we just don't have enough time and the client isn't requesting it and it's just something that we can wait for later. The key is to understanding the difference between need and want in the QA process. And I'll say it again. You need time to fix the bugs. So oftentimes we get stuck in this idea that we have the greatest QA process ever and the best designers and the best developers on the planet, and we'll never do anything wrong. So of course we don't need time to fix anything, and we can work right up until the day before launch, right? Well, I hope you didn't find a bug in your QA process the day before launch, because that's going to really put a hurdle on things, huh? So it's not just about making sure that everyone is accounted for in the budget, it's also timeline awareness and making sure that you're doing your QA process earlier than the day before it goes out the door, right? So reflecting back a moment to the design process about allocations. I can hear you, PM Stacy, back there yelling at me about the budget, telling me that the developer has other stuff to be doing and they don't need to be involved in the design process because they're not designers, they don't know anything about that. Well, hopefully you do. And hopefully that we've made the case here today for you to be able to talk to your project manager and your sales team and say, I do need to be in those conversations. It's important that I bring a different perspective. It's important that I talk about functionality with a designer before they're telling a client something, right? Making it happen isn't really as stressful as it needs to be, but we need to make sure that we are communicating the importance of that time being accounted for when you're building the timelines and the budgets for your projects. Because let's face it, that doesn't happen right now. So, in conclusion, it's really not that hard for designers and developers to get along, right? Yeah? Yeah? We all love each other? Yeah? Okay. Once we open up and let each other kind of understand our workflows and our processes, and we take the time to understand little pieces of how each other works, and how our teams are built and put together, we can really start to kind of break down those walls, and we can be more collaborative, and we can understand a way to kind of streamline the way we work together to ultimately put stuff in front of a client that isn't going to hinder the outcome and like extend a timeline or go over the budget, right? So the more people that you have coming together with different perspectives, the better the discussion is going to be. And with that, I will end with a couple of minutes early so that way we can have some questions, but hopefully that we have a better understanding of kind of how to talk to our team and figure out, where we can ease some tensions and kind of streamline this process a little bit better. So does anybody have any questions? Shoot.
Can you describe the testing steps for the QA, design QA?
So what we would normally do is kind of have the mock-up on one screen and like the production environment on another screen and go through and just compare. I'm not one to go pixel by pixel, but I know some designers are very particular like that. And that's why when I'm talking about understanding how environments work, it helps designers say it's okay that that's 2 pixels off, it's really fine, because at the next breakpoint when you drag your browser 2 inches, it's gonna be different anyway. And really we're just running through all those things to make sure that relatively everything is matching one-to-one, and that the functionality that we were proposing most of the time in a static mockup is being translated into the production environment. Yeah? Yeah?
So that brought up a good, interesting question for me, which is, from the design side, things have gotten so fluid from the development side as far as like all the different techniques for, scaling, not just the fonts, for all of our different heading levels,
right.
And, just everything's so fluid now. There's so many techniques from going from, just purely based on every little change in your browser, things can change without hitting breakpoints anymore. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that even changes, you've got rems and now that are and stuff that are based on, based on different things, and they can be completely fluid. So how, as a designer, and like you said, designers are sitting there and they're thinking in pixels, which are long dead at this point, and so I don't want to talk about pixels.
Pixels as in font size, or like the width of the component kind of?
Yeah, I mean, well,
both, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Right.
because we did a project recently for the first time in a long time with a strictly sort of design department and implementing stuff, and we broke their brains trying to explain how fluid design works.
Yeah, that's
like,
a tough one.
So, I mean, like, they just couldn't get their heads around it, like, but it's supposed to be this size. We're like, yes, but, you know, it's going to scale. Everything is going
Exactly.
to scale with the device size, you know. And
Yeah. So that's a great question, and that one is just as much about education as it is about like them pulling their weight and kind of coming into like the 21st century of design, right?
Yeah.
Me as a designer, I design in Medium and I use a tool called Webflow. So all of it is fully responsive and should be fluid right off the bat. So maybe trying to figure out some more tools that would have some more responsive behavior would be helpful too. But
Yeah.
ultimately, it kind of boils down to being like, I might just have to cater to your browser, because there are some clients where they're like, but on my Windows machine on Internet Explorer, it doesn't go above the fold. Well, above the fold isn't a thing anymore either, right? And some people are just going to kind of be stuck in that frame of mind, and you just have to move on. But trying to educate them as much as you can and explaining to them, like, get on a video call and just show them real quick, right, what it's all about. And hopefully that is enough, but sometimes it's not, right? So
Adobe XD and Sketch both have a bunch of really great tools for
Yeah.
designing for multi-size devices that let you do a lot of cool sort of interactive demos with your sort of static design stuff.
yeah, and all the prototyping and stuff. Yeah, it's really cool. Okay, we'll start here and then come back there. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So a lot of this seemed like communication's kind of central, honestly.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you have any like tools or processes that you particularly like or dislike, for that matter, for facilitating the communication back and forth between teams?
Well, Slack is what we use internally, and that's really a great thing for me, especially because our company is fully remote, so it's not like we're going to be sitting in a room anytime and having these conversations. But it's also really great to have conversations in the tickets themselves. So like whatever process management you're using, like Trello or Jira or whatever, you can have conversations in there also. My preference would be to just kind of have either a Slack conversation or to jump on a call. A lot of stuff can be resolved faster in like a 10-minute Zoom call than trying to have a 45-minute Slack conversation that probably spanned 3 days and could have been fixed a lot sooner. And those kinds of things too really impact how long it takes to complete a task. So that's why sometimes when you find like minor things that you're like, oh, maybe a designer might want to have some opinion about this, it might just be faster to talk to them than writing it in a ticket, for example. So, yeah.
Okay, so in the previous slides, you were showing a couple of workflows. Were they adding to each other, or were they different workflows? And if you could go back to it,
Yeah,
and see what they were.
let's find those, huh? The first one. So it's sort of like building off each other, but like in pieces in the middle. So this first workflow was the standard, like what most of us are doing now, and that is you finished a task, someone reviewed it, they found a bug, and then we're done with it, right? But then the next one, we're kind of adding to that in the middle somewhere, where we did the front end task, the development team did the QA, but instead of when we find bugs and then launching it, we're assigning it to like the second QA. Now, not all the time is it going to be technically a second QA person, because we do, like I was saying, sometimes there are teams that do both the front end and back end QA at the same time. But what would be really helpful is to at least have the designer that was working on the project have eyes on it before it's being presented to the client as like a finished piece, right? And then let's find the other one. So the development QA, when it affects design. So this one, again, is building in the middle of that other one, where you're going to say, do I need a designer to fix this problem, yes or no? And if you do require a designer to fix that problem, what normally happens is it goes back into the design phase, which then goes to the front-end development, which then goes to the development QA, which then repeats the cycle. So it's not necessarily like a straight line, but kind of adding pieces in the middle.
And these steps are built in or mapped to the project management tools that you're using. Like you can say this piece represents this in Jira, or this represents this, or this part in some other project management tool.
In an ideal world, yes, but we're not currently implementing it with any tools right now. But she's going to yell at me and tell me we are. So this is my boss. This is Amy, the CEO of Hook 42.
I'm a certified project manager.
Yeah.
Whatever. It doesn't matter. It all depends on what your internal tools and processes are. So you can use things like either tags or labels or, columns in your Kanban boards. It depends on, are you using, a waterfall technique or Kanban or a mixture of the two. So the answer, it depends on what you're doing. Follow best practices. And it also depends on what type of project you're on. Like sometimes you have these little bolt-on, like, hey, I'm going to add a tiny little bit of design somewhere, and the client doesn't have a lot of budget and stuff. So it's challenging. So you just really need to bake it into the overall process.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
I think the key is to bake it in from the beginning.
exactly.
Because
Yeah.
like my company, my former company, we weren't doing any of this at all.
Yeah.
And it was causing a mess.
Yeah, and
And then we go back to them and be like, hey, we need more design hours. And they're like, wait, what? That's done. And then we had to like explain.
So who's here a part of an agency, like a development agency? So there's a few. Who is a client who has budget to pay to an agency? Nobody. Okay,
With
yeah.
budget or not at the budget?
Yeah, exactly. And that is what I'm getting at. I was like, okay, who has money that they're like, okay, well, I only have this much. How much can you do for me? And it's an ongoing challenge, even for internal houses, like you guys are like Avis, right? So you have a limited budget.
Yeah, well, we work as we act sort of like an internal agency, so we charge money.
Yeah.
So our client pool is sort of
Yeah, and yeah, so you just have to make it in early, and hopefully if you're in folks like with Davis or like the CAL, like the UC systems, a lot of them have like templates that exist that you have to follow now, so you can, it shortens some of that design QA over, but you still need it.
Yeah.
We very heavily use the term empowered project owner, and we hold our clients to it, and our clients are involved in seemingly a lot more of the process than kind of what I was thinking from the presentation. I don't know, because you guys were talking about like really QA and stuff before the clients see it. It's like, we're trying to make sure our clients see things all the way through. I mean, at the end of our sprints and stuff, we do a review and we show them stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, they've seen it before then.
Yeah,
We
so
have a hard time with that in our agency because it's like halfway done. They're like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this?
right. And the
Getting
point,
there.
the point that I'm trying to make with that is like not to cut the client out, right?
Yeah.
But the point is to make sure that like if you are going to show it to the client without the people that were building it and already had these conversations with the client, that you're saying we didn't do a full review of this internally, but here's where we stand.
Yeah.
And then go back and say, designer, is this okay? We showed the client and they had some feedback, but we weren't sure, like if you were finished, that kind of thing. And making sure that you respect that they want to see it, but respect that you have a agenda and you have a timeline and you have a way you work with your clients that they're involved in the process too. So yeah, you don't want to obviously cut them out, but
Well,
And the
and
big-
from
the
a
big thing is
perspective,
stuff like they add budget and scope
Yeah.
possibly. Like
Yeah.
they don't, nobody intends to.
Right.
So that's why there's an internal validation of, did I just design this to that within budget and scope and expectations, maybe that were like made early in the sales process. But the client gets, they love it, they have fun, they're designing, and it's like, oh, this is cool, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, but go ahead. Sorry.
well, I mean, not to just pile on, but as the perspective of someone who's often a client, and I've been on the agency side, knowing that this is going on and not like, there's a point where you know, I think as a client, when you're presented something that hasn't been thoroughly or doesn't look like what you had expected, and then suddenly you're being told that, well, my feedback is now out of scope, and
Yeah.
suddenly I have to pay for more rounds of this.
Right.
I don't know what the balance is, but I mean, I guess I appreciate the idea of this happening before it comes to me
Sure.
as a client, but at the same time wanting to.
So the idea is that you've already had those conversations where your feedback was given before it gets to development, right? And not saying that you don't get to have feedback in other areas, but that we're just making sure that we got all of your feedback before we're giving it to you again and saying we're finished with this piece, and you're like, why doesn't that look like what we talked about anymore? Like, that's not what I asked for. So we're just kind of checking to make sure that all of those boxes that you originally requested for are actually marked off. And then if you have more feedback, great. Like, that's what we want to have, an open conversation and an open discussion to make sure that you're getting what you need. But we're not saying that, what I want to avoid is like delivering something to a client that we haven't double checked before it goes out the door, right?
Yeah, sure. But I will say this, there's certain things that you're not going to see until like it's been built to a certain level.
Right, and
And-
the clients have to understand that.
Well,
And the problem is the clients don't often understand that. So you understand that.
I do, well, and this is the thing, and this is something that I feel like I often come up against at that camp, is that there's like that idea that, oh, the client doesn't really know what we have to go through.
No, no,
The same
a lot
way,
of
like
people
at the
do,
beginning of your
yeah.
slides, it's like, no, the clients have an idea what's going on.
Yeah.
So if you're telling them that this interactive bit, that you're convinced is working right, but they're like, I'm not sure that's the convention.
Yeah, no, and it's not saying that you don't know what you're asking for. It's saying that we're not necessarily understanding what we're promising you, right? Like, we didn't do our homework first and making sure that we said, well, we can do what you asked and then some, right? We're not saying that you don't know what you're asking for. We're saying we didn't go take it a step further, right? And we're saying, well, we want to do that and then some, and that's going to take the same amount of time. Well, that very rarely is the
That's
case,
right.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think the end result is it's really everybody getting it wrong. It's
Right.
the client, it's the designer and developer, so everybody knows we're not asking for something that is substantially out of budget or like the gravity switch, it's not possible, you know? And that's where the developers help the designer, helps the client, and they all help each other to
Yep.
understand the most fruition, you know, the best end goal, you know.
And I will say from a agency perspective, one way you can save the money is rather than have the design QA. So yes, design QA after dev QA because you don't want them to find broken things. If they still find broken things, give them a limit. Say if you
Yeah.
find 5 things, stop. Because that means you're wasting your time. So that way you save the designer from only finding things that happen to be already broken or whatever that we know about and that need to be caught by dev. So that's one way you can save the designer some time and some client hours by.
Right, and that's why you do like the development QA
Yeah.
first, and hopefully the designer is giving the QA ticket after you've built it, you checked it, it looks right. Hopefully you were 100%,
And
and
there are things that we think are fine that the designer's like, but this is broken.
exactly.
So, but if they're like, what happens a lot with our agency, which is dumb and it's just why I don't work there anymore, which they fix one thing, but then they break 5 other things, right? So when they think it's all done because they've checked off all the original dev QA things, then the designer finds the new dev QA things. So like I said, at some point, give them a stopping point. Say, if you find more than 5 things, stop and go back to dev and say, I'm not reviewing this until you've done another round. Because you save the back and forth at that point. Because if they're finding your dev bugs, they're not finding the design bugs. They're too distracted by the dev bugs. So that's what we found to work best. Ideally, your developers would not break 5 other things.
So I used to run an agency, and our process actually looked a lot like this, and we arrived there over time, and we found that it actually, in the big picture, we were able to accomplish it in similar budgets and with higher client trust, like just better results.
Especially bringing the developers in early on, because then you have fewer revisions of like, who can do this.
Just less spinning of wheels, less
Yeah.
false starts.
Yeah.
we're working on a project where the designer promised something and the dev was like, okay, cool, like, that totally makes sense, but started building out the mockups, and then the designer's thought, well, yeah, that's the visual appearance of what it's supposed to do,
Right.
but the actual functionality of what data's loading, that's totally wrong. So we had to gut the whole homepage and redo it.
Yeah,
So
Yeah,
it's like, that was a 30-minute conversation, would have saved 2 days of work.
exactly.
yeah, I mean, and it all comes down to insert the designer plus the business analyst that's running the functional requirements with sample interaction, or like, you know, where you use like Webflow or other types of tools that the mockups have more interaction,
Mhm.
and you can feel it more than just static comps.
That helps so much
helpful.
more rather than PhDs.
Yeah, and that big jump from just like living in a flat CSV
Right.
to going into something that feels like web that's some of the biggest leaps, especially for clients who are really used to looking at print
Right.
versus web.
Mhm.
So I mean, more people are web ready now because it's so prevalent.
And the
But
tools have gotten better, like it's
Yeah.
C and Envision, all that.
Yeah, that's cool too. I worked with that recently.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've worked with various tools. I think right now my company does XD, but Envision works too.
yeah, and I just want to like really underscore what Drew said. It's like working this in through the process really make sure that it just unclogs anything before it becomes a big issue.
Mhm.
And it's like within budget, it's within time, but the whole process of a project needs to have that woven in.
Yeah, and if your clients have seen you walk through the roadmap with you and you say, we build in these extra hours because of this, so that you don't have the surprise hours at the end.
Yeah.
We found that they were okay with that as long as they were planned for.
Yeah.
The other thing that I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I don't see the project manager role in here, because from a project manager, you need to be making them play nice. And what I mean by that is
Yeah.
like, I'm just going to give an example. The design team designed a menu, a main navigation, and it was supposed to work a certain way in mobile, right? Well, the main navigation part in desktop's fine, but in smaller screen sizes, you know, they just designed this thing that was way too fancy. It wasn't going to work for accessibility. But it got handed off to the developer, and the developer spent one sprint working on it, didn't finish it. Spent another sprint working on it, didn't finish it. And the project's finishing up, and you know, I was sort of in a bit of a project management role. I said, hey, what's going on here? It's like, well, this thing has to tab, and so now I've written 500, 10,000 lines of JavaScript and still not done. And it's like, so you had to get involved and say, come here, design guy, come here, development guy. Design guy, you need to design something that's way simpler. Development guy, you should be able to do that in a day, right? Yes. Yes? Okay, good. Go design it, get it by noon, get it done by tomorrow, done. And it like, but by not having that conversation, by not stepping in a little earlier and being like, what's going on here? You do need to talk to each other. Because he was like, the design guy is hired me in the organization. He said, here's the design. I didn't question it. I'm going to work for as many weeks on end as it takes to make this work.
And that's where communication within your organization comes in, because your developer has to have the courage to go and say, this isn't working.
Yeah.
And like you said, though, like having that person to mediate, though, is really important. And I wasn't really getting too deep into the project manager thing. I should have prefaced with that, assuming that they're there the whole time watching over like a hawk, right? They should always be in every phase of the project because they're managing it, right? And they should understand how each person works, and they should understand the efforts involved in these things, and understanding when the roadblocks start to happen, how to kind of mediate those things. But it also circles back to the designer should have probably understood that thing was going to take them 18 hours to make versus a 4-hour alternative, and having those conversations where the developer could recommend the quicker solution and the designer can probably implement something that even looks visually really close to that, and it cuts the time to build it in half, and it just takes that conversation quick 15 minutes and you fix it. Yeah.
We have a lot of UCS men. They say yes to everything until they're tired. So.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for ending your day with me. And And there's more chocolate, so come take a piece on the way out.
I didn't want to presume that it was.
Oh, take a piece. Yeah, go
Are
ahead.
you adding the deck to the sessions page?
I can do that.
Some of these graphs don't translate to typed numbers.
Yeah.
Are you sure though?
Are they accessible?
I like what I was doing was like writing it out word for word how I would do it, and then I'm like, now how do I make that visual? So yeah. A paragraph was too much, and the graph is a little confusing. So thank you. Thank you.
Right now.
No, sorry, I meant.